everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be talking about Jund tokens in Modern Horizons 3 Draft. As always, notes are available at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. I don't really expect to be able to use 17 lands for useful stats when talking about 3-color decks. I often like to say this deck wins this often relative to other archetypes, or it's drafted this much. I didn't even try to analyze that for this. So in my preview episode for this format, I talked about how Jeskai was clearly doing an energy thing, Abzan was doing a modified thing, Esper might be doing a control thing. The other color combinations, it wasn't so clear what they'd be up to. Now that I've had a chance to play with the cards and kind of get in the weeds more, I have a pretty good idea of what I want to be doing with Jund and why. And so I thought I'd circle back and explain. So, Writhing Chrysalis, I think everyone knows by now just how good and or dominant that card is, and it's one of the main draws to this archetype, both in that it's one of the cards that might put you into the archetype, one of the cards the archetype uses really well, but also one of the cards that the archetype is good against. So this to me is kind of like the natural conclusion of the Writhing Chrysalis meta, where Writhing Chrysalis is very good at leading to board stalls, because it gives you like a large reach blocker that's really hard to attack into, and then it also makes 2 chump blockers, so you can't really like go over it, you can't go around it, you kind of just like need like a hard removal spell, or you're kind of brick-walled. But it's not always great at attacking, because your opponent also probably has spawns that they can chump with, and they might have like a death touch creature or something. And so, in my experience, Writhing Chrysalis, when it doesn't just run someone over, leads to board stalls. And the idea with this deck is to take advantage of those board stalls by basically burning your opponent out. So, you can't really plan to get a lot of copies of Writhing Chrysalis anymore, because everyone knows how good it is and they drafted accordingly. I kind of, predicted early that the stats on Chrysalis would drop once it became harder to get a lot of them in a deck. That has happened a little bit in the last week's worth of data. Writhing Chrysalis is only the 6th best card in the set, with a win rate that has dropped below Amped Raptor. Still, of course, fantastic, way above reasonable for a common, but the decks don't really get to just be the Chrysalis show. You're not often going to get to like curve Chrysalis into Chrysalis and just run people over. Your deck is going to have a Chrysalis, but it needs some other kind of plan, and because no one's passing Chrysalis, it can be hard to just draft red-green. Other people might have it and it might be contested, and so it kind of makes sense to be prepared for the possibility that you could end up needing to play a 3-color deck to get playables if you start with a Chrysalis that you're committed to. And so Jund is a pretty reasonable place to look, where, especially if you think that other people in your table are going to be trying to do standard like big Eldrazi stuff, this is going to be another angle that'll have you looking for slightly different cards than that. So that's kind of the like general reason for the deck to be, and it's like metagame placement and a little bit of how to get into it. I think, there's a lot more going on here. There are really a lot of cards that support this plan, as we'll get into. But fundamentally, you're trying to lean into stalled boards. Obviously, you're a deck that is very focused on your opponent's life total. So if you can make early attacks happen, that's great. But you want to be in a spot where you're pretty happy to just kind of like sit back and wait until you just kind of like draw enough creatures that your opponent doesn't have any life anymore. So the key cards that give you this reach are Marionette Apprentice, the 1 and a black, 1/2, fabricate 1 uncommon that makes your opponent lose life whenever a creature or artifact you control dies. Glaring Fleshraker, the 2 and a colorless 2/2 that makes a spawn whenever you cast a colorless spell and makes your opponent lose a life whenever a colorless creature enters the battlefield under your control. Molten Gatekeeper, the 2 and a red 2/3 that makes your opponent lose, that deals damage to your opponent whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control. Nadir's Nightblade, the 2 and a black 1/3 that drains your opponent for 1 whenever a token you control dies. And Spawn Gang Commander, the 2 and 3 red 2/2 that makes 3 spawns when you cast it. You can spend a colorless and a generic and sacrifice an Eldrazi to do 2 damage to any target. So it's kind of a large amount of cards that can directly damage your opponent from just kind of like outside of combat in red and black. So notably, like all of those cards are red and black. So it's like, okay, well, what's green doing here? And why isn't this just like a red-black archetype? And it can be. It's weird. Like, so red-black is, you know, there are a couple of approaches to red-black. I don't want to get deep into like a red-black episode here. But basically, you know, there's like the affinity thing. And then kind of separately, there's this like tokens, pings, sub-theme, but like because so many of the red and black cards are devoted to the affinity thing, and the affinity thing doesn't play that well with the Eldrazi thing or the ping, it like has some overlap with the ping thing, but also some non-overlap. And green has a lot of overlap with the Eldrazi stuff and is very good at making tokens. And so I think like all of these cards kind of work better if green's also in the mix. And I don't think that like the red-black, like I think red-black has like halves of 2 decks, and if one of them is like wide open, it can be pretty good, but it's generally fairly awkward. And I think green just supports this half of the red-black deck really well. So on top of those creatures that kind of give you like persistent damage, you also have Skoa, the legendary 6 mana 4/4 that does 4 damage when it enters and lets you Grandeur into a Fire Blast, sack 2 mountains, discard another Skoa to do 4 damage to any target, and Ghostfire Slice, the 2 and a red 4 damage to any target that costs 2 less if your opponent controls a gold card. So you have a couple of different cards that can just do 4 to your opponent, so some more reach there. And then to support all of these like guys that ping your opponent when creatures enter or tokens die or whatever, you want to prioritize token makers. So you have Basking Broodscale, the common 2/2 for 2 in green that you can spend 1 in a green to adapt 1. And whenever you put a counter on it, you make a spawn. Card's really good here. Malevolent Rumble, 1 in a green sorcery, mill 4, put a permanent from among them into your hand and make a spawn. Also really good here. Eldrazi Repurposer, 2 in a green, 3/3. When you cast it, make a spawn. When it dies, make a spawn. Glimpse the Impossible, 2 in a red. Exile the top 3 cards of your library. You can cast them until end of turn. Any that you don't cast go to your graveyard. Notably, they don't stay in exile. We'll get more on that later. And Writhing Chrysalis, of course, at common. And then at uncommon, you have Idol the False Gods, the 2 mana artifact that you can spend a generic and a colorless and tap it to make a spawn. And then whenever an Eldrazi dies, it gets a +1/+1 counter. And then when it has 8 counters, it becomes a creature with Annihilator 2. Path of Annihilation, the green 4 mana enchantment that makes 2 Eldrazi spawns and lets your Eldrazi tap for a mana of any color. Propagator Drone, the 2 mana 2/2 that gives all of your drones or your spawns evolve and lets you spend 4 mana to make a spawn. Skittering Precursor, the 2 and a red 3/3 menace that makes a spawn when you sacrifice a non-token. And the Hunger Tide Rises, 2 and a green Saga that makes 3/1/1s and then lets you one at a time, and then lets you sacrifice any number of creatures to search your library for a creature, library and or graveyard for a creature with mana value equal to or less than the number of creatures sacrificed. So a lot of token making available is what I'm getting at. And all of it's pretty good. All of it plays well with the cards that burn your opponent out. So, like, that's kind of the backbone of the deck. Get as many of those things as you can. Pair it with some removal, some cards to make the mana work, maybe a couple of other creatures to fill out your curve, and you're good to go. You can also play other go-wide payoffs, such as Fangs of Colonia, the 2-mana sorcery that puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature, and then doubles the number of counters on it. But you can overload it for 6 mana, and it does it to all your creatures. So while this is generally good in a deck with a bunch of +1/+1 counters, you don't really need a bunch of +1/+1 counters if you're just very wide, because it'll make a ton of +1/+1 counters by itself at that point. It that heralds the end, the 2-mana 2/2 that pumps your Eldrazi's, and also makes your 7-mana Eldrazi cost 1 less. Not that I think you're super in the 7-mana Eldrazi business in this deck. Reckless Pyro Surfer, the 2/2 with Landfall Battlecry, and Titan's Vanguard, the red-green 5/5 for 5 that when it enters and attacks puts a +1/+1 counter on all of your colorless creatures. So those are all kind of good go-wide payoffs that play well with your plan to make a bunch of tokens. On top of all of the token stuff, there's another thing to be aware of that's happening in Jund, and it plays really well with the token thing. And there's a graveyard sub-theme that really takes advantage of the fact that Malevolent Rumble and Glimpse the Impossible fill your graveyard really well. And so if you have some of those, ideally multiple of each or 3 total or whatever, then you can start looking for cards like Victimize, 2 and a black, sacrifice a creature, return 2 creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped, and Fledgling Dragon, 4-mana 2/2 flyer that if you have Threshold is a Shivan Dragon, a 5/5 flyer with fire breathing for only 4 mana. Actually a really good rate if you reliably have Threshold. And Pyretic Rebirth, the red-black uncommon 4-mana instant, return a creature from your graveyard to your hand, deal damage equal to its casting cost to target creature or planeswalker. All of those are kind of awkward in most decks, but become really, really strong when you have Malevolent Rumble and Glimpse the Impossible to set up your graveyard. You can also use stuff like Quest for the Necropolis, the 1-mana black quest that can return a creature from your graveyard to play, and Eldrazi Ravager in this space. Eldrazi Ravager is the 6-mana 6/6 Annihilator 1 with cycling 2, and you can sacrifice 2 Eldrazi to return it from your graveyard to your hand. I like that as a way to enable Pyretic Rebirth. Also, it's just kind of... Sometimes with your Writhing Chrysalis, you just want to sack the spawns right away to make it big. And so you can, if you find 2 mana early, you can cycle this thing. And then when you sack those, you can, instead of sacking those spawns just to themselves, you can sacrifice them to this to get it back. And then you have this thing where, maybe you want to cast the creature eventually, but before you cast it, you can just kind of grind some card advantage out of cycling and returning it as you have spare mana and Eldrazi tokens or Eldrazi's that are dying anyway or whatever. So Eldrazi Ravager is generally pretty neat card to look for to include it here, and you can also get it back profitably with Victimize or Quest for the Necropolis. It is a big creature that you can reanimate. Also, you're already in a lot of colors. You probably have some a good amount of fixing. There is a version of this deck that splashes Kozilek's Unsealing, the blue card that makes 2 spawns when you cast a creature with mana value 4, 5, or 6, and draws 3 cards, and you cast a creature with mana value 7. That card is a very fun engine with Eldrazi Ravager, because the Ravager makes 2 spawns when you cast it if you have the Unsealing, and then if it dies, you can sack the 2 spawns that it made to put it back in your hand and repeat the process. So, Unsealing is a interesting card to consider splashing in some builds of this, more for the 4, 5, and 6 triggers than trying to draw 3 off of 7s, but just making 2 spawns a bunch is really strong with the setup here. You can also dabble in Evolution Witness with this graveyard stuff. That's the 3-mana 2/1 with Adapt 2 for 2 mana, that when it gets a +1/+1 counter, returns a permanent from your graveyard to your hand. That can work out pretty well if you're milling yourself, and then plays well with stuff like Cursed Wombat and Revitalizing Repast. Cursed Wombat is also like makes your Writhing Chrysalis huge. Cursed Wombat is the 2-mana 2/3 that whenever you put a +1/+1 counter on a thing, put another +1/+1 counter on it, and it has Adapt 2 for 4 mana. I don't want to go like super hard into the like green-black Adapt stuff most of the time in this like Jund go wide style of deck, but I think, you know, Wombat can have a place, and Evolution Witness has been good to me as a light touch. Having like 3 Evolution Witnesses has felt like too many. It feels kind of good sometimes to have 2 of them because you can like loop them with each other, but I think that 1 is generally the sweet spot, and if you need to get it back, maybe do it with a different card, like or the quest or whatever. But mostly, you know, the 1 witness gives you so much access to your graveyard, and it's like a little bit clunky that more of them has felt like too much. Sundering Eruption, the red DFC 3-mana destroy a land, its controller searches for a basic, puts it into play tapped, and non-flying creatures can't block this turn, is really good in this deck because of its penchant for board stalls. I prioritize all of the MDFCs very highly. A lot of them are great. I replace lands with them directly, but if I have like 5 or more MDFCs, then I don't mind playing an extra land or 2 if I like don't have enough good spells that I want, or if I need more fetchable lands for my landscapes or whatever. I think that it's correct to think of MDFCs just as lands, but they're like utility lands, and if you have like enough of them that it's super hard to flood out because you have so few lands that aren't also spells, then you can just play extra lands and it's fine. Making the mana work in this deck is trickier than it looks because you're often more of a 4-color deck than a 3-color deck. And the landscapes seem like they should be really good fixing because they can give you colorless mana or one of your missing colors. The problem is there are 4 different kinds of mana you're looking for, and the landscapes require you to choose a single kind that they're giving you access to throughout the game. And because when you sacrifice them, the land that you're getting enters tapped, if you like don't have a forest and you don't have a green card in your hand, you still might need to use a landscape to find a forest preemptively in case you draw a green card, and then you don't have the landscape around to give you colorless mana. So when you're kind of stretching your mana into 3-color and using landscapes to make it work, the landscapes don't really count as colorless sources the way that you might want to count them when you're looking at your like ways of generating colorless mana. So I think that this deck wants to very highly prioritize cards that actually give it multiple colors of mana, like alternately, like you don't have to commit to one. So like the DFCs that are 2 of your colors are very good, and you really want to prioritize stuff like Nightshade Dryad and Solar Transformer that can give you any of your colored mana or colorless mana. And even Worn Power Stone can be really nice just as a stable colorless source that also ramps you. The deck can have like a lot of ways to spend mana. So, you know, you're not always going to want Worn Power Stone, but it's definitely something to keep in mind, especially if you have Spawn Gang Commander. Spawn Gang Commander wants a lot of colorless mana, and it's much stronger if you don't have to sacrifice your spawns as the way to get the colorless mana. So I would generally significantly increase how much I'm looking for Worn Power Stone if I have Spawn Gang Commander, unless I already have a few Dryads and Solar Transformers. Nightshade Dryad is the 2-mana 1/2 Death Touch that taps for a colorless or a mana of any color. Solar Transformer is the 2-mana artifact that gives you 3 energy when it enters, taps for a colorless, and taps and spends an energy for a mana of any color. And Worn Power Stone is the 3-mana artifact that enters tapped and taps for 2 mana of any color. A sacrifice theme can also make sense here. Chthonian Nightmare, the rare 2-mana recurring nightmare variant, is incredible here. But you can also have like a minor sacrifice theme with Infernal Captor, the 3-mana 3/3 with Exploit that threatens a creature. And then Eviscerator's Insight, the 2-mana sack a creature, draw 2 with Flashback, and sacrifice a creature artifact. And Lethal Throwdown, the 1-mana sacrifice a creature, destroy target creature. You can also sacrifice a modified creature, and then you draw a card. Captor gets better if you have more other sack outlets, of course. You're making a bunch of spawns and maybe germs and stuff, so that gives you easy fodder for all this. So, usually I just kind of look at commons and uncommons as, what I'm expecting to do with the deck. And then people ask me, so what gets you into the deck? And I'm like, I don't know, maybe open a good rare or whatever. In this case, I think a lot of the time the reason to get into this is if you start with Writhing Chrysalis, you can kind of look for some of the like red stuff that plays well with having tokens, and then kind of keep this in mind as a pivot if other options aren't open, or if you see good cards for this, or maybe you first pick a Writhing Chrysalis and you get past a Marionette Apprentice, and you're just like, I know what I can do with this. These are great cards. Let's do it. But also there are some rares that work really, really well in this strategy where I think this is kind of the best thing you can do with them. For example, there are a bunch of rares that are like pretty graveyard centric, and because of the overlap in Jund with a Malevolent Rumble in green, Glimpse the Impossible in red, and like Victimize and other, graveyard stuff in black, Jund is a very, good fit for any of the graveyard-centric strong rares. For example, Grist, the 1-mana 1/2 Death Touch that when it or another creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard, you can spend a green to turn it into a Planeswalker. The Planeswalker can blow stuff up and also make tokens, which is what you want to be doing in this deck. It is not very easy to trigger Grist. You can look for... the easiest way is probably with Retrofitted Transmogrant. You can also use the quest for the Necropolis or Victimize. So this is a good shell for Grist. There's also Nethergoyf, which is the black escape Goyf that like Tarmogoyf, but it only counts your graveyard. Really good with the self-mill stuff. Chthonian Nightmare, of course. Detective's Phoenix, the 2/2 flyer for 3 with Bestow red and collect evidence 6 that you can bestow from your graveyard. 6, the 2/4 Treefolk that when it attacks, mill 3, put a land from among them into your hand, and then permanents in your graveyard have Retrace and Shifting Woodland. All of those are graveyard-centric rares that are all very good in the Jund deck and, might work in some other decks, but that they're going to all be at about the top of their potential in the Jund deck. Also, rares that make tokens: Kozilek's Command, Springheart Nantuko, and Ophiomancer. Kozilek's Command is the colorless X spell with 4 modes. Notably, one of them is make X spawns. Springheart Nantuko is the 2-mana 1/1 with landfall, make an insect. It can also bestow to give the bestowed creature a +1/+1, and then when you landfall, you can spend green and colorless to make a copy of the bestowed creature instead of the insect. And then Ophiomancer is the 2 and a black 2/2 that at the beginning of each upkeep, if you don't control a snake, makes a 1/1 snake with Death Touch. All of those are great here. Party Thrasher, the 1 and a red 1/4 that at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you can discard a card to exile the top 2 cards of your library and choose one of them to be able to play until the end of the turn. Party Thrasher is a generically good red card that's not really great in most of the red archetypes because it's not that aggressive and it doesn't do anything with energy. So it's not like the best fit. It's strong enough that it's fine, but it's like nothing special. I think it's pretty great in this deck. It helps fuel your graveyard with by discarding a card every turn and then continuing to dig. Whichever card you don't choose will stay in exile, but you're still like getting further with the discard thing. You have like a lot of tokens, so you can really take advantage of the convoke, and then it also double dips on the convoke value with glimpse being another way to cast stuff from exile. And then Warren Soul Trader, the 3-mana 3/3 that lets you pay a life and sacrifice a creature to make a treasure token, is really good here. If you have it, you really want to prioritize Marionette Apprentice and Nadir's Nightblade, which will make you very, very good at burning people out, as you can sacrifice all of your spawns to make treasures and then sacrifice the treasures and double up on your Marionette Apprentice and Nadir's Nightblade triggers. White of the Reliquary is very good here. It plays well with both the self-mill stuff and also having random useless, 0 power creatures that you can sacrifice to find lands. That's the black-green 2/2 Vigilance that lets you sacrifice a creature to search your library for land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So those are the notable rares that I think you might want to take early and consider Jund tokens as an option whenever you start the draft with any of them. Those aren't necessarily like the strongest rares that you could start with, like, Curbomination's not on the list because while it's amazing, it's going to be amazing in any black deck. Whereas these are the cards where when I start with them, I'm going to be putting, Jund tokens at the top of my mind in terms of decks that I might look to move into if they're open. I don't want to see any of these as like hard commitments that way, but they would certainly point me in that direction. Obviously, also the Jund rares, the ones from the Commander set, Dissa and Corum or whatever, would be reasonable reasons to go in Jund. And that's my spiel on Jund. So I want to turn it over to Twitch chat for follow-up questions and thank the newest patron at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Thank you very much, Adam. Also, if anyone else is looking to join the Patreon and support the podcast, again, check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Are you ever running a Siege Smash? Since you have larger creatures and a lot of incidental damage, how does something like Colossal Equipment fit into this archetype? I think Siege Smash is a very reasonable trick to play here. I agree that it's a great way to make a Writhing Chrysalis do work for you in spots where it's hard to get it through, and it lets you just kind of trade a spawn for a wide variety of things or whatever. So yeah, I think that's a reasonable, there are a lot of, the structure here, of course, was here are all the commons that point to and support this particular synergy and then this particular sub-theme. I don't in any way mean to suggest that any of the other commons are playable, more that they don't have strong explicit synergies in these directions. A card like the Dreadmaw Equipment does have additional synergy with being wide, of course, because if you have a bunch of Eldrazi spawns around, then you're going to keep having fodder to turn into Dreadmaws to force your opponent to deal with. That is slow but powerful and will win long games where your opponent is kind of trying to play defense and rely on creature removal to save them and they don't have an answer to the equipment. The card has, a decent, not exceptional, but certainly not bad win rate. It can certainly be punished by fast decks or by disenchant effects, especially stuff like Witch Enchanter and Warpscape Battle Mage that kill it for less mana while leaving a 2/2 in play. But it is a reasonable top-end card for the archetype, but much the same way that it would, like, it fits here similarly to how it fit in a lot of other archetypes. Similarly, a card like Nyxbloom Hydra is a good way to use extra mana from spawns, and also the fact that you're wide means that you'll reliably have something to bestow it onto. So that could be another good fit with a lot of the same advantages and disadvantages as the Dreadmaw equipment. So, yeah, there are, your deck is probably not going to be exclusively token makers and token payoffs and some removal. You're going to have some other just kind of like generically good creatures and appropriate combat tricks in there. But all of that stuff is, going to be evaluated roughly the way that you would normally evaluate cards. But yeah, I think Siege Smash is a good call out. What do you think of Gift of the Viper in this space? There's the Spawn Gang combo, but in general, sack a spawn, kill an attacker, worthwhile inclusion in a deck. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with Gift of the Viper in this space. It is worth calling out the combo with Spawn Gang, where if you give it Death Touch, then it can sack an Eldrazi to kill any creature. And then also, yeah, if you just, you play Crysis, your opponent kills it, now you have these 2 spawns, your opponent attacks with a flyer, and you have 1 mana sack. You basically have built your own lethal throwdown, like a 1 mana sack a spawn, kill a creature. And then you also, if you're into the Evolution Witness space, it's also pretty nice to be able to turn it into like a 1 mana regrowth that also puts a +1/+1 and Death Touch and Reach counter on your creature. So Gift of the Viper, another trick that I'm pretty happy to play here. You need to be careful with not playing too many of Revitalizing Repast plus Gift of the Viper plus Siege Smash. But yes, you do, have a lot of small creatures. You're sometimes like in, especially if you have a lot of the like aggressive go wide payoffs, like It That Heralds the End and Reckless Pyro Surfer and Titan's Vanguard that are pumping all of your spawns so that you want to be attacking with all of them, then the combat tricks are going to be a better fit so that you can like send your whole board into an opposing blocker and have combat work out profitably for you. Is there any use for splashing Essence Reliquary in this deck? I'm not going to tell you not to splash Essence Reliquary in a deck. I love an Essence Reliquary. Your mana is, strained. You want to be sure that you're only getting into that kind of stuff if you are already set. Mostly, you probably have like multiple Nightshade Dryads, and if you're trying to get that fancy, I hope that you have maybe something like a Path of Annihilation to get you enough mana that you can be returning and recasting your stuff. But, anytime you have the infrastructure for it, I think Essence Reliquary is a really powerful card. So if you have a deck where it looks like a good fit, I would not discourage trying it out. Ashling plus Gift of the Viper is also no joke. That's true. Raptor plus Gift is great to build a First Strike Death Touch. Also works. How do you feel about which direction to take a Gen deck a Gen deck mid-draft to the go wide space, or the graveyard space, or the sack space? So that's kind of the whole idea here, is these aren't really different spaces, right? Like the enablers for the graveyard space, the Rumble and the Glimpse, both are token makers. And then the tokens that they make are good to sacrifice. So the idea is all of these things naturally fit together. So you don't really need to pick a lane. It's more you should be aware of all the payoffs for the space that you're in. Now, it is possible to be in the go wide space and simply not see Rumbles and Glimpses, in which case you would not want to prioritize the graveyard stuff as much. But it's also not going to be bad if you have some cards that use the graveyard without like explicitly filling your graveyard. So I guess the answer to like mid-draft, how do you figure out where to be, is the more Rumbles and Glimpses you have, the more you should lean into the graveyard stuff. And then like The sack stuff is basically like if you get some Infernal Captor often goes very late. If you get some of them late, then you might want to start looking for some like throwdowns and Eviscerator's Insights to pair with your Captor. Or if you have a Warren Soul Trader or Chthonian Nightmare, those are like the best sack outlets. So if you have those, then you'd want to like actively look for Infernal Captors to pair with them. As far as like the rest of it, I would say you might want to prioritize rumbles and glimpses even more highly than you might otherwise early to open the door for the graveyard stuff. But you should be prioritizing them highly regardless because they're just very good cards in the token plan. Dreadmobile is another card to get into in the sacrifice space if you have Infernal Captor. You can also play it generically. I'm a little skeptical, but it's not terrible when you have a bunch of spawns regardless. How do you account for mana for something like a Fleshraker? So that's kind of what I was talking about early on, or early when I was talking about how the mana is harder than it looks, and it's difficult to reliably use landscapes as your only fixing for dedicated colorless symbols. Worst case scenario, you can sacrifice a spawn to play a Fleshraker. It's, better if you don't have to, but it's not the end of the world if you do. This is mostly, you want to prioritize Solar Transformer and Nightshade Dryad to tie it all together. But also, like, realistically, some portion of the time you're going to be like, well, hopefully it works out such that I can use the landscape, and if not, at least I have a bunch of rumbles and glimpses, and I can sack a spawn to get this thing going, and then my other stuff will make more of them, and it'll sort itself out. How often is there an artifact sub-theme? How much speculative value should you put on cranial rams? I think so. There's a little bit of overlap, of course, with germs as tokens when you pair it with the living weapon stuff, and the equipment plays well with retrofitted transmogrant, which plays well with the graveyard stuff and sacrifice stuff, and the equipment makes your spawns better because you can put a ram on a spawn and it works pretty well. I think for the most part, most of the time, I'm not looking to be very artifacty here, but if I see a bunch of rams early in the draft and one of them tables, then I'll be like, okay, I can probably get a lot of these things and then they become good. So if you're in a space where you're not fighting for the black artifacts, then you can, start taking rams and familiars, and you might end up going pretty deep on the artifact stuff. Molten Gatekeeper is an artifact that you're looking for regardless. And the charge bug is a little weird and out of place, but becomes good pretty quickly if you have any rams, because it does push damage pretty reasonably. So for the most part, I'm not very invested in the artifact stuff, but you should watch for it, and there will be times where you want to go deeper on it. How many rumbles, glimpses before you start to worry about decking yourself? I don't. I think you'd have to have crazy numbers to worry about decking yourself, because the whole point of the deck is that you're generating a lot of incidental damage, and once you get into the I have a whole bunch of these things, then you're probably pairing it with victimizes and fledgling dragons and worm coil larvas and big things that end the game pretty well. So this isn't the just dirtle forever kind of self-mill deck where you really need to worry about decking yourself. I would hope. I think that you're just going to be sweet, I dumped my graveyard into my library into my graveyard, and now I just burn my opponent out and it'll be fine. Especially if you have a bunch of Molten Gatekeepers and you can unearth multiple of them and then cast a Glimpse and then just like burn your opponent for 6 or whatever. When you use Glimpse, how often do you play it turn 3 just for the spawns? Or are you generally trying to make sure you're getting at least 1 land drop out of it? So I generally don't want to play it turn 3 because I would prefer to have like a Fleshraker or Gatekeeper in play first. But, if it's my only play and I'm like following it up with his Spawn Gang Commander or something, then it's okay to play on 3. Where I generally prefer to play it is on turn 4 after playing a 3-mana payoff for it. And then maybe I'll play a land off of it and make 2 things, or maybe I'll make 3 things, and I'm kind of fine with either of those. Are you ever getting the Mythic Blue Ugin instant and not playing blue sources for it? So I don't think that this deck naturally really wants to play 7-drops, and while milling it would be awesome, you have very few ways to discard it. Mostly you would need to play like Scurrilous Sentries. I imagine that if I'm trying to support that card, that I would want to have access to blue mana, because it's just so much easier to get it in the graveyard then, and like, a single island and a couple of fetch lands, maybe like Nightshade Dryad would be enough. I do think it's splashable. I do think that it would be fine to, play 6/8 reach, 7-mana common Eldrazi, or, if you happen to be further along in the artifact direction, maybe even play Frogmere Enforcer to trigger it. I think the card's great. I think it's worth splashing. I think you can view milling it as a significant portion of its value proposition if you have a lot of self-mill stuff, but it sounds like I would be unlikely to play it with no blue sources, just because you might as well put a blue source in if you're trying to play it. That card's great, though. The trigger that bounces all of your opponent's permanents will generally win the game. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm not sure really what to say. Like, sometimes I try to, tie this back to a tight conclusion. I guess just to reiterate the central idea here, there are a lot of token making cards, a lot of payoffs for going wide and for creating creatures and for having creatures die. They all fit together pretty well as long as you're careful to really prioritize making your mana work seamlessly. And there's a lot of good graveyard value you can get out of this if you prioritize Malevolent Rumble and Glimpse. Malevolent Rumble in particular is great because it can also help tie your mana together. Once you're doing that, look for especially Victimize and Fledgling Dragon, but also Paratic Rebirth and other stuff that's using the graveyard. And, there's a ton of good cheap removal in this archetype that I didn't spend a lot of time talking about, but don't sleep on it. Also, the Fang Flames, the colorless 4 damage, exile something. The fact that that's a colorless spell and makes a token with Fleshraker is not to be overlooked. Anything that's triggering Fleshraker is pretty great. So if you have a couple of Fleshrakers, more highly prioritize those among your removal spells to get those extra triggers. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening, and I will be back next week with another archetype as chosen by the patrons. So, bye for now.
For light speed.